Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be Part 45, Chapter 45, entitled Something Wicked This Way Comes. Normally, Midoriya remained relatively quiet when in the car with Aizawa, especially at the beginning. Even now, even as experience led them to an understanding, they usually didn't engage in more than mild conversation, but it wasn't out of discomfort. Not anymore, at least. If anything, it was more out of recognition. Yamada was the one he shared light-hearted, thoughtful chats with across the kitchen island. While with Aizawa, he shared his deepest vulnerabilities and quietest fears. It may not have been equal, but everyone understood it was fair, which was why both Midoriya and Aizawa really didn't speak in the casual setting of the car, unless otherwise necessary. But that was when it was just the two of them, and they would be two no longer. "Is this not the most wonderful thing?" Gami exclaimed for what had to be the 100th time from the back seat, throwing himself into the cushions. "You know, I think you are underreacting." Midori resisted the urge to rub a hand down his face. "Look, Gami, I know it's your first time in a car, but I swear—" "Is this all you really do when I leave?" The ghost interrupted, lurching forward to stick his head over the center console, looking side to side between the two in the front. "You two are so boring." "Some of us can appreciate the silence." Midori rolled his eyes. "Both of you hush," Aizawa snapped, without any real malice, stopping briefly at a red light. "We're almost there already." Aizawa was getting scarily good at reading their conversation beats. Midori supposed it came with the job. "I'm surprised that you, of all people, are acting so antsy. What are you going to do when we get to Yaoyorozu's?" Gami scoffed, sinking to the back again. "Trust me, the whole ghost thing gets old fairly quickly. Still," he sighed, crossing his arms like a child. "I suppose I will have to leave you alone, then, the travesty." "As long as you both behave, I don't care what either of you two do," Aizawa muttered, sending a knowing glare to his peripherals. He then pulled over to a side street, rolling the car to a stop. "You sure you don't want me to drop you off closer, problem child?" But Midori shook his head, grabbing the backpack that rested at his feet. "We'll be all right. I'd rather not risk anyone seeing you drop me off. It's not really a question I'm ready to answer right now. Therefore, there is a possibility that her sudden hatred for you was also the work of your curse." The teen dispelled the thought as quickly as it came to his mind. Now was really not the time. "I get it." The hero nodded, his eyes fixed on the steering wheel before turning to Midoriya. "I'll be back here to pick you up later. Call me if you need anything, all right?" He clicked open the passenger side door, stepping out to the sidewalk. "We just want to make sure you never have to do it alone again." Now that thought, he let that one linger as long as it wanted. "I will, Aizawa-sensei. Thank you." His teacher didn't give him any sort of verbal response, but the slight nod and equally slight smile was all he needed to know. Midori sent him a delicate wave, watching the car pull off before turning to his mentor, readjusting his backpack in the process. "Ready to go?" "Such in a rush to get away from me, I see." Midori started walking. "You're so dramatic. You're acting like you're not coming with me." "It does not count if I cannot talk with you." Still, Gami floated to keep up with him. "Are you sure we are going in the right direction?" "It's literally just a block or so straight," he huffed. "Have some faith in me." "So if you do manage to get us lost, despite that, does that mean I am allowed to—" The snarky remark died on the ghost's tongue as his gaze was drawn off to the side. Midoriya, too, mostly forgot what they were bantering about as his eyes moved to follow. An intimidatingly elegant iron gate stood before them, impressively grand in its steely might. The barrier stretched high, far higher than anything Midoriya could have attempted to climb successfully. He'd vaulted over some high fences before, though this one was no fence. Behind the gate, however, stood a house so massive it would be an insult to compare it to the gate, or even to a house at all. The structure was more akin to a palace, with beautiful circular towers framing the sizes. A classy mesh of stone and brick painted the walls with a soft yellow glow that illuminated the windows. The whole thing reminded him of a fireplace, with the balcony mounted above the large mahogany double doors like an empty mantle. Yaoyorozu's mansion emanated this warmth of a home that simultaneously drew Midori in and made him know that he would never belong. "Whoa." The words were stolen from him along with his breath, whisked away as the fee to merely stare. "Talk about wealth." Gami fidgeted uncomfortably. "Pardon, but are you another of Yaoyorozu-sama's classmates?" Startled, the teen had jumped back slightly. His attention snapped from the allure of the grandiose back to the metal gate, where a suited man stood on the other side in collected nonchalance. Yes." Midoriya had stuttered out, embarrassment creeping onto his cheeks. "I'm here for the study group." If the man, who Midoriya assumed was Yaoyorozu's butler, noticed his nervousness, he didn't comment on it. "Would you hand me your student identification card?" Of course." He fumbled with his backpack, and then reached out his plastic card through the bars of the gate. The man took the card from him, holding it up to a clipboard in his other hand. Midoriya had bounced on his heels anxiously as he scanned the list, resisting the comforting urge to glance over to his mentor. "Thank you, Midoriya-san." The butler handed him back his ID, and Midoriya had skittered back as the gates creaked open. "Allow me to bring you to Yaoyorozu-sama and the others." He walked through, trailing behind the man as the gate swiftly closed behind him. And as they walked up the front steps to those large mahogany doors, Midoriya could now see the cameras placed in the corners of the entryway. Gami frowned, also noticing the blinking red lights on each. A high level of security. I suppose it makes sense. Midoriya moved to nod silently, but Gami stopped him before he could. "We should act cautiously. No need to do anything strange that could be caught or heard on cameras." And he knew his successor understood, because he ignored him and continued ahead as the butler had beckoned. For a moment, Midoriya was even more enamored by the interior of Yaoyorozu's home. Sets of magnificently large windows lined the halls, draped by luscious burgundy curtains tied with charming gold accents that just barely missed the floor. The floor itself was a cherry-stained hardwood polished to perfection, with an intricately woven woolen rug in the center so obviously expensive that Midoriya felt bad stepping upon it. Candles hung against the walls, emitting that soft yellow glow he saw from the outside, but upon a closer look it wasn't from flame. Instead, the light was electric. All the candles were actually, and with a convincing disguise he almost wouldn't have known. He had to squint to make sure that the wax really wasn't melting. The butler led him down the rest of the hallway before stopping abruptly at another set of double doors. Distracted, Midoriya nearly ran into him from behind, but managed to catch himself just before he did, though still stumbling awkwardly. Usually his missteps were a bit more graceful, but it seemed like Ami was really taking the whole camera thing seriously. The doors were opened for him, and he peered inside nervously, softening once he saw the familiar faces of his classmates chatting around a long dining table. Yaoyorozu noticed him first, and beckoned him in further, catching the rest of the class's attention. "Midori!" she called with a joyous smile. "Oh, I'm so glad you could make it. Thank you again for helping me to organize this." "Of course, Yaoyorozu-san. It was really no trouble." He waved it off. Her face slightly crumpled after that, and Midori wondered if he'd said something wrong. Afraid of any wrong impressions, he tried to backtrack, but she didn't give him the chance. "There's no need for formalities. Please, call me Yaomomo." He cocked his head on instinct, but otherwise gave a firm nod. She bounced excitedly, much like a young child. "I'll be right back. I just want to make sure everyone is properly accommodated for." And just as quickly as she came, she left his vicinity for another group of classmates. The instinctual side remark to Gami shot up his throat, but he caught it before it could escape his lips. Ida, noticing he was alone now, strided up to him in a pointed and punctual manner, enough for Midoriya to rethink his current train of thought in preparation. "Midori," Ida's hand chopped up and down. "While I commend you for helping to officiate our first study group, the responsibilities of class secretary include arriving early to these events." He scratched his cheek sheepishly. "Sorry, it's a bit of a drive here." He gestured a glance at Yaoyorozu, who was happily chatting away with another group of newly arrived students. "Did I miss anything?" Ida shook his head, but a small smile betrayed him. "I think she's just excited to have us all here. I can say it's not often I get to have friends over." Midoriya smiled too. "And the nickname?" "Courtesy of Ashido." That made him laugh. He should have known. They talked for a bit longer until Yaoyorozu made her way back to the front of the room to gather everyone's attention. "All right, everyone, we're just waiting on—" "Sorry, Yaomomo," Kirishima interrupted, waving his phone out. "But I don't think Bakugo's coming." Yaoyorozu dropped her shoulders crudely, but managed to resist the sigh that threatened to escape her. "Let's just get started, then." She cleared her throat swiftly as the last remnants of the conversation had died off. "So, as you're all aware, midterm ranks were passed back yesterday." Some despondent moans from the corners of the room cut her off accidentally, but she didn't seem deterred. "No one is obligated to share theirs, but I'd recommend grouping together based on the areas you're struggling in so that we can help each other." She patted a stack of heavy textbooks resting on the end of the table in front of her. "I'm going to be going over quadratics and anything else math-related in here, but you're all welcome to move to any of the other open rooms if you'd like a quieter space to study something else." She then tapped the top textbook, again with a growing smile. "And just let me know if you need a textbook. Odds are I probably have it." Sensing she was done talking, most of the class had dispersed amongst themselves into idle chatter. Instinctively, Midori looked around for Uraraka or Ida, and conveniently found them both off to the side. "Midori!" Uraraka waved him over excitedly. "How did you place on the midterm?" "If you would like to share," Ida quickly added. He chuckled naturally. "I think I was second." Uraraka rolled her eyes with a scoff, but he could tell it was all theatrics, and only made him smile more. "Man, both you and Ida did so well. I was 13th. He gave her a shrug in return that most would consider a pitiful comfort, but Uraraka just laughed, nudging him playfully in revenge. Midoriya rubbed the assaulted arm, before turning to Ida curiously. "What did you get, Ida?" Ida stiffened, puffing out his chest in pride. "I placed third, though I think I'll be staying here to practice my math a bit more." Uraraka nodded in understanding. "I lost most of my points on classic literature, so Sue's going to help me review that." She then turned back to Midoriya. "What about you?" "I'm not sure." He scratched awkwardly at his cheek. "Well, now that I'm thinking about it, I should probably review Heroic's Law again." Heroic's Law? All three turned to the new voice, only to see Todoroki idly strolling up to them, a softly curious look upon his face. "I only got 5th overall, but I did pretty well on law and history. I might be able to help with that," Todoroki offered, voice dying off as he continued. "Or if you just want some company." Uraraka threw her hands up in exasperation. "Only? I swear with you guys." Midoriya laughed, nudging her playfully. "Hey, you have plenty of time to study before the final." He then turned to Todoroki with a wide smile on his face, settling to something a bit softer. "And I wouldn't mind some help." Todoroki nodded in agreement, gesturing toward the exit, the 2 wide-open mahogany doors that led back into the hallway. That was enough of a cue for the group to part their separate ways, with Todoroki and Midoriya moving out into the hallway together. Midoriya looked around nervously, unsure of which open doors Yaoyorozu was talking about earlier, but as Todoroki suddenly started in a random direction, he was forced to catch up. "You know where you're going?" Midoriya looked around again as he trailed behind, only then realizing Kami was nowhere to be found. He followed up with a curse under his breath. He wouldn't be surprised if the ghost was out snooping where he wasn't supposed to. His friend nodded, pointing to a set of open doors near the end of the hall. "I figured we'd be better off somewhere quiet. Yaoyorozu said I could use it if I wanted." "Oh, that's nice of her." The space wasn't as big as the main room, but its smaller size just added to the cozy feeling. Rather than a dining table and chairs to match, the room was furnished with some large armchairs surrounding a coffee table. An electric fireplace crackled from the far wall, oozing a rich heat into the air. The room was well lit, yet kept a shimmering golden glow of both wealth and warmth. Midoriya was caught between feeling in awe and feeling sorely out of place. Awkwardly, he walked in before Todoroki, choosing his armchair and placing his backpack in it. He figured that Todoroki would pick a chair close to him and unzipped his bag to start taking out materials. "Hey, Izuku." He placed down a notebook on the coffee table before looking over his shoulder. "Yeah?" Only then did he notice the now-furrowed look on Todoroki's face. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right, after what happened with Bakugo a few days ago." He moved further inside, closing the door behind him. "What he said was harsher than usual, and you've been quieter than usual since." Midori immediately bit into his cheek and didn't even flinch as iron hit his tongue. "Yeah, There's a possibility he's been infected since before the battle training incident, even before coming to UA." His voice died off instantly, and he didn't even have to look at Todoroki to know that he didn't believe an inkling of his words, but he looked anyway. And what he saw was everything he expected, including the twinge in his chest. Todoroki had always been too observant for his own good. Because Midori had always been sharp concerning his own secrets, they were his, but really he was afraid. He didn't really know what he was doing, for as much as he pretended, and other than Gami's sporadic memory, he had no one else. And who else would ever understand that his power stemmed much further than a quirk, that his job went much further than the simple black or white of Heroic's Law? He was afraid that if what his quirk really was, what he really was, became common knowledge, everyone that knew would just be as afraid of him as he already was. People were scared of what was different, and he was far past that point. He never expected to tell anyone about what his quirk really was, but then again, he never expected the slew of pro-heroes at UA to just accept him. Sure, there were plenty of dangerous quirks out there, but those could all be controlled in a way. Quirk-canceling handcuffs, mutant-built restraints, whatever else they used to lock away prisoners of Tartarus. None of that, not even the threat of death, could apply to him. And that The difference. Should have easily had Nezu in Eraserhead and Present Mike and everyone else who found out in a span of a week, rushing to lock him away where they could control him. But instead, they loved him. They loved him for everything that he was, and Midoriya couldn't hide how selfishly addicted he'd grown to that feeling. And so here he was, conflicted, just as much as when Aizawa and Yamada had first welcomed him into their home, because he was still scared, for as much as he tried not to admit. He was still scared of what he was, and what the people that he'd grown to love would inevitably think of him. But he'd had a taste of what love really was, what acceptance really was, and he was chasing it blindly, ready to risk destroying himself if it meant a chance of tasting it again. Which was why he hated that Todoroki was so damn observant, because he had already suspected so much, and Midoriya had no issue acknowledging that he was right about everything. But he was still a coward. Izuku? Midoriya blinked, struggling to come back into focus. It was then he realized how close Todoroki stood, barely a few inches away. It was then he realized his hands were being cradled in the other's, smooth polyester against rough skin. It was then he realized how badly his hands were shaking. He instinctively looked around for Gami, looked around for guidance, the dam in his throat just barely holding together. But he wasn't here. What would Gami think? What would he do? Midori thought farther back into the past. Gami would tell him to lie. He would tell him to make something up, that he couldn't risk this secret, and then give a shitty example because Gami was terrible at lying, for as often as he had recommended it. But right now, right here, Midori didn't want to lie. If Gami were here, he wouldn't hear the end of how bad of an idea this was, but Midori wanted so desperately for Todoroki to accept him. All of him. Maybe after 500 years, this wasn't Gami's secret anymore. Midoriya started to open his mouth, feeling the flood in his chest rattle in anticipation, when his shifty eyes finally locked onto something. Todoroki immediately followed his settled gaze, turning his head over his shoulder and trailing aside up to one of the cameras in the far corner of the room. Todoroki snapped back to him. "Do you trust me?" Midoriya nodded without hesitation. Todoroki let go of one hand, but gently pulled him along with the other. He nudged open the doors, poked his head out of the slight gap that he'd made, looking carefully in either direction, all while Midoriya had waited nervously behind him. After a few moments, though, his hand was slowly tugged again as the other had led him down the hall in a delicate but purposeful set of steps, until they stopped in what seemed to be the middle, and Todoroki had reached for an obviously shut door. Some more anxiety bubbled up. Didn't Yaoyorozu specifically say only open rooms? He didn't want to betray her kindness like this. He opened his mouth to try and persuade Todoroki against this, but nothing came out. He trusted Todoroki. Todoroki opened the door and pulled them both inside. To Midoriya's surprise, inside was not a room like the others, but rather a closet bigger than he'd ever seen. Everything was ordered along shelves and racks perfectly in place, kept against the walls. The middle of the room was spaciously empty, to the point where Midoriya couldn't tell if it was bigger than where he'd stayed when he was still with his... Never mind. Todoroki looked up at him, seeing the newly furrowed look in his eye, and frowned softly. "There aren't any cameras in here." He took a sweep around the room. "I think." Midori looked around the room, but even in the near-perfect darkness, he couldn't see any of the signature blinking red lights he saw by the front entrance. He exhaled in what he wished was relief, but his shaking had long traveled from his hands, and now the rattling in his chest was starting to shake him entirely. He was pulled again, but this time he landed in a set of open arms. His knees nearly gave out on him, as his heart had instinctively settled into this place of warmth and safety. And the fear inside of him, that desperately wanted to push away, was dashed when Todoroki held him tighter, and Midoriya finally gave in and clutched back like a leech. "I'm really worried about you," Todoroki murmured from over his shoulder. "So much has happened, and sometimes I can't tell if you're really okay." Midori moved to reassure him, but the way Todoroki tightened his arms, he remained silent. "I trust you. I want to take you at your word, but I'm so afraid that I'll miss one small thing. By the time I catch it, I won't recognize you anymore." Midori didn't realize he was crying until the tears had dribbled down his lips, and his mouth moved to catch them before they could stain the back of Todoroki's shirt. He was so lucky. What had he done to deserve so many people in his life who loved him? He truly didn't know. Midori sniffled, blinking away the rest of his tears before they could come pouring out. "I need to tell you something. About my quirk." Todoroki nodded, from against his shoulder. "I didn't figure it out until the day Bakugo yelled at me, but you were right. He stopped instinctively, waiting for the other to question him, but Todoroki just listened, and it all came spilling out. I'm so sorry. The hate, I didn't mean, it's all my fault. And I knew, and I stayed anyway. He could feel Todoroki stiffen, but it was too late. His mouth was moving before his brain was, and it was too late. My quirk curses people. What happened to you, the sports festival? Midoriya blubbered, tightening his hold on Todoroki's shirt. I didn't know. His voice broke to smother some sniffles, but it wasn't enough of a pause for his brain to catch up. But Ida, I knew and you were right, and I just didn't want to admit it because I didn't want to be alone anymore, and I wasn't going to say anything until Bakugo. His knees did give out on him that time, and he sank to the floor like a lead weight. He would have pulled Todoroki down with him, but his arms just didn't have that kind of strength anymore. Still, Todoroki sank down with him. And finally, his brain caught up, and he just sobbed heavily into Todoroki's arms. The guilt of the past few days catching up to him, too. He and Gami started with just theories, but he knew, long before Bakugo's outburst. He knew right when Ida looked like he wanted to rip the jugular out of his neck on the train. Todoroki knew then, too. Hell, he knew the moment after their conversation in the hallway during the sports festival. He knew. And what did he do? He refused to leave the people he'd learned to love, and instead watched as he slowly took them down with him. Even now, even after everything, he couldn't bring himself to leave the security of Todoroki's arms. He waited for the other to push him away, but he couldn't bear to leave himself. Todoroki still hadn't spoken a word. What a disgusting shadow of a person he'd become. Your quirk. The other's voice was raspy, like Midoriya hadn't heard it in a long time. Your quirk was the reason I tried to kill you during our tournament match. Midoriya fought hard to keep the bile in his stomach this time, flashing back to that hell of a day. Sure, not all of it had been bad, but he couldn't stop the way his head immediately went back to that battlefield. Waves upon waves of ice charging to skewer him, his own skin covered in frostbite, Todoroki's frostbite, that dark, dead look glazed in his eyes. His lip quivered as the memory settled to the forefront of his mind. It really had always been his fault. Something jostled his shoulders, and Midoriya looked up, only to find Todoroki's hands firmly on them. No, listen to me. Your quirk was the reason I tried to kill you during our tournament match, not you. But I knew, and... Look, I don't think I totally understand. Todoroki stammered with a bit of uncertainty before stealing over, looking back into his watery eyes. But I'm sure you didn't want me to hurt you on purpose. You didn't ask for your quirk to try to... You can't blame yourself for something out of your control. Midoriya's mind stumbled. Was it really out of his control? He couldn't stop the curse from happening, that was true, but he could have just left. He could have left Todoroki and Ida and the rest of the people he cared about, and kept them safe instead of selfishly holding them close where he knew he'd hurt them eventually, no matter how hard he tried to fight, but he'd left Bakugo years ago, and if the budding realization was right, then did it really matter? If he left everyone he loved now, would that even protect them from his own undoing? But something else in his head clicked, and Midoriya swallowed the incoming sob and the shudder that came with it. Wait, I thought you didn't remember what happened during the sports festival. Todoroki looked off to the side immediately, and Midoriya stiffened, his throat running dry. Well, it's more fuzzy than anything. He started to trail off. But some of the harsher things I said. I'm not pretending to be anyone's friend. Some of the things I was feeling. And yet I'm being flooded with my own hatred and loathing for you, none of which feels like my own. And the things I tried to do. Let me end you. Todoroki jolted back up, and Midoriya couldn't miss the watery shine of fragility in his eyes, barely masking the guilt behind them. If that really was your quirk, I need to know. I need you to tell me. And Midoriya, seeing the damage he had done, broke as easily as dropped china. My quirk makes the people in my life hate me. And I don't know how or why, but I didn't realize it was such an issue until I figured out that Bakugo's probably been infected for years now. And my mother and my father, and if I didn't notice them, how many other people did I miss? How many other lives have I ruined? He curled into himself, sobbing wildly again, fist bunched into his eyes, trying desperately to hold back the waves of guilt. I knew I should have left. The second I saw the same hate in Ida's eyes as I did yours, I knew I couldn't be around anyone I loved if I didn't want to hurt them. But you all make me feel like I'm worth it. Like it wasn't a mistake to try and do something good with my life. And I can't lose that. I can't go back. Todoroki wrapped his arms around his hunched form. He cried harder. Please don't make me go back. The other pressed his face into Midoriya's back, shaking his head ever so slightly. Never. Never. They held each other in silence, save for the sniffling and choked sobs that occasionally erupted from either of the two. They cried together. They cried over the cruelty of the world, for the guilt they had aged, in unfairness for all they had suffered, and in selfishness for all they had done. They cried and cried on the floor of a storage closet, until their tears were enough to fill every bottle and bucket around them. I don't understand, his voice spat when it ran out of tears to choke on. What happened to you? To Ida, you should hate me. Why don't you hate me? And Todoroki pulled his head back up to look at him, wiping the tears from his eyes, all while desperately holding back even more by the quiver in his lip, all while fighting so desperately to bring a smile to his face instead. I could never hate you. You're someone I care about. And Midoriya gripped him tighter, desperate to prove to himself that this was real, desperate to prove to himself that he could still be loved, desperate to prove that he somehow deserved it after everything. I'm not going to leave you, not over this, not when I tried to kill you during our tournament match, and you stayed anyway, he declared with such ferocity the whole room had shook. I swear to you I won't leave. You're never going to be alone, no matter whatever your quirk tries to do, and together we're going to figure this out. Your quirk is never going to win. How? You quirkless misfit, get out of my way. How, when it already had? Bakugo's still being affected by it. He has been since that day. How, when it already had taken so much from him? Therefore, there is a possibility that her sudden hatred for you was also the work of your curse. Todoroki pressed both his hands to the sides of Midoriya's face, startling him out of his thoughts and back to now. Not any more. Thank you, Izuku. I promise I'll never let you down again. And for just a moment, for a fraction of a second, even without Kami, something in Midoriya's life felt obtainable. No matter what his curse tried to do, it would fail. It would fail because he had found someone who would stay with him regardless. He would never be alone. It was quite the odd occurrence, being in a car with Aizawa in the back seat rather than at the wheel. It was even stranger, having a thick glass-like panel separating the back of the car from the front. Aizawa had assured him that this was all standard protocol, but that didn't do much to dull his nervousness, especially seeing a shred of his own feelings in his teacher's eyes. With Nezu organizing this whole thing, it was hard not to be. Midoriya tried to take his mind off it, turning to stare out the window and toward the sea. His heart stuttered at the sight of the vastly open water, and despite the curiosity brewing in his gut, he dared not to look any further over the side of the bridge they were driving across. Never once did he think he'd find himself leaving the main island of Japan, but here he was, on a seemingly infinite passage toward the dark, looming building he could barely make into view. Tartarus. How Nezu had ever thought this could be a good idea, he truly didn't know. Heading straight into a prison that housed the country's most dangerous criminals, and for what? So one of them could teach him some fancy blade tricks? How in the hell did Nezu think the benefits outweighed the risks here? The man had killed 17 pro-heroes and injured countless more, one of which was Ida's brother, who would never walk again, and Midoriya was just supposed to believe that all he wanted was to train him. Hell, he had been part of the group to stop him, part of the force that had kept him from taking Native and Ida down with him that night. He'd been there, for each and every one of the hero killer's murders, as a painfully silent bystander. Something cold touched his hands, his shaking hands, and he jerked his head up. Gami, who'd been sitting silently between them, quietly ran his bony fingers across Midoriya's skin without even so much as a glance to him. And Midoriya, without even so much as a word back, curled his hands with the ghost, staring blankly out the window again. There was something about a straight drive to essentially the deepest pit of hell that filled Midoriya with something akin to emptiness, an inevitable dread piled in his stomach, settling like a weight at the bottom of the very sea around him. An eerily and uncomfortable familiar feeling. He swallowed hard, feeling his throat start to run dry. Maybe it wouldn't be as bad as he thought. Maybe, by some miracle, everything would somehow work out all right, like it somehow had with Todoroki during the study group a few days ago. Though, as Tartarus grew even closer, Midoriya couldn't help the sinking feeling that this would definitely not end the same. The day he told Todoroki about his curse, it had been just them, a rare occurrence in itself. Gami usually never left his side, especially not as of late, but this time the ghost had been painfully absent, The longer Midoriya dwelled on it, the more his mind excused that it was probably for the best. Something about the whole thing felt intimate. It was just a moment between him and Todoroki, something of guilt and sadness, of hope and worth. Sobbing in each other's arms, Midoriya just knew that it was something meant for them, and them alone. For once, he was glad Gami didn't coincidentally come back during the middle of it. When Gami did come back, the moment had long passed, only remembered by the residue of puffy redness that still stained their cheeks, and Todoroki's scar had hit his easier, but it was impossible for Gami to be fooled by a face he'd watched grow up for 11 years. But he didn't ask, at least not until they were in the privacy of Midoriya's room again, all while the boy had toiled over how he should answer. A part of Midoriya was ashamed to admit that he considered lying to Gami, his mentor, his best friend. Part of him had really considered keeping what had transpired between him and Todoroki a secret. The curse, his powers, being a death. That was all his secret now. He didn't need Gami's potential backlash on who he should share it with, but the more he thought about it, the more the thought of lying to the man who'd stayed beside him without question for over a decade became more sickening than the thought of his disapproval. He could never, ever lie to Gami, so he told him. Gami wasn't as upset as his brain had prepared him for. He was worried, for sure, but by how easily he'd let it go, Midoriya figured there was a part of the ghost that had trusted Todoroki nearly as much as he did. Maybe he really would get to introduce them one day. The car slowed down by the prison entrance, and Midoriya had gripped Gami's hand just a bit tighter as a group of guards inspected the car and occupants before finally opening the mouth of an infernal bronze gate to let them inside. He didn't know what he expected Tartarus to look like, but as they drove into what almost seemed to be a sizable city corner, this was not it. The sheer size of the island was intimidating, and Midoriya was caught between wanting to look closer to erase the unknown and wanting to sink further into his seat and pretend it wasn't there. Spotlight towers pinned every intersection and entryway, lights dancing across the road so frequently that he was forced to shy his eyes away. The buildings didn't seem like prison cells, and there certainly couldn't be as many high-risk criminals as this implied, right? But then why the size? Why the sheer volume of structures? Midoriya didn't like the ways his brain was starting to go, so he just stopped thinking. The car finally started to slow again, this time to a stop, in front of 3 large warehouse buildings that lined one of the walls of the island. The driver exited, and Midoriya didn't dare move a muscle, his heart pounding rabbit-fast in his chest. Everything about this screamed danger to his instincts. Everything about this screamed for him to run as far as possible away. What the hell was he doing here? What the hell did Nezu think it was worth bringing him to easily the most dangerous place in all of Japan? What the hell was worth being in the easiest place for them to lock him away, where his powers, his curse, couldn't hurt anyone else? Someone, a guard, opened his car door for him, and it took everything Midoriya had to force his jello legs to stiffen into something useful again, stepping out of the car, one wobbly foot at a time. He took in a slow, deep breath as soon as most eyes were off of him. Even from ahead, he knew how intensely Gami bore into him. He could feel it. And while most of the time he liked the validation when Gami shared his instincts, it wasn't helping this time. Gami was nervous, uncomfortably so, and that did nothing to quell his own anxieties. Maybe it was just the atmosphere of Japan's highest security prison. Maybe it was something more, but regardless, being inside Tartarus gave them both this terrible, terrible feeling, and they couldn't escape the echo chamber of knowing just how unnerved the other was. Midoriya tried to hide his fidgeting, but couldn't stop the small jump as someone, Aizawa, moved to stand next to him. "I'll convince him this isn't worth it." Aizawa didn't bother making eye contact, keeping his voice low and private. Nezu, that is. But Midoriya just solemnly shook his head, remembering just what had happened when Aizawa tried challenging Nezu last time, phantom bile sloshing around his throat. "No, just—" He pressed his eyes together, clenched his fists, and tried to will his body into stillness. "It's okay." The teen didn't even have to look up to feel Aizawa's scowl. "You interested in Katsudan for dinner tonight?" Midoriya nodded. "That would be nice." The guards in front of them motioned to follow, and the teacher sucked in a breath. Anything there that happens and you want it to stop, just say it. I'll get him to call the whole thing off." Midoriya remembered Nezu's previous words. "You speak as if you have a say in the matter, and not as if you were made aware only by courtesy." Midoriya fought back a yell, a scream, and a sob at how powerless it all felt, and nodded silently instead. One of the guards held open the warehouse entry door, and Aizawa walked in first, before Midoriya trailed in after. To his surprise, the massive warehouse was relatively empty, filled with nothing more than some overhead walkways and overbearing floodlights. Midoriya expected more. His fear expected more, but all he was met with was a barren room, and Nezu standing near the middle. That was enough to get nervous again. "Ah, finally! I was wondering what was taking you two so long." Nezu waved at them before starting to make his way over. Two guards, once standing next to him, quickly matching pace. "I was beginning to worry you bailed on me." Aizawa did not share the same lightheartedness. "Let's just get on with it." Nezu smothered what sounded like a chuckle. "Very well, very well." When the principal didn't continue right away, Midoriya looked around for the inevitable kind of surprise that Nezu loved to spring, and sure enough, Nezu reached behind him, as one of the guards had handed over a set of neatly stapled papers. "As I'm sure at least Aizawa's aware, places like these are a bit complicated in protocol." He strolled over to them, passing along a set of papers to each. "So to get on with it, you'll both have to ensure the Hero Association and the Japanese government that what you see and perhaps do inside Tartarus stays inside of Tartarus." Gami peered over Midoriya's shoulder as his successor flipped through the pages all filled with tiny, almost illegible lettering. A binding contract. These never ended well. Midoriya looked back up at Aizawa, searching for any angle he could to get a read on him, on the situation, but all he could find was a faint, trapped look of desolation instead. His teacher turned to him. "Yeah, we just sign it." Nezu eagerly handed them pens. "Of course you do. We can't continue without it." Oh, how nice it would be to just snap the pen instead, but Midoriya refrained, following Aizawa's lead and signing his name at the end. The rodent practically ripped the papers out of their hands, all with a sickening smirk of glee plastered on his face, and suddenly Midoriya felt very, very unwell. "Wonderful!" He handed off the contracts to one of the guards, standing beside him, before beckoning the rest of the group to follow. "Now, if you would come along." Nezu strolled over to the side wall of the warehouse, up to an ominous door that normally wouldn't unnerve Midoriya as much as it did if it weren't for the excitement in which Nezu did it. The rest of the Tartarus guards quickly closed in, stepping in front of the principal to get the door for him. Midoriya instinctually shuffled closer to Aizawa as the guards closed in, bracing himself for whatever could be behind that door, and then everything worse. But even still, nothing, not even the growing pattern of Nezu's apathy, could prepare him for what was waiting for him. They were in a new warehouse building entirely. Midoriya figured that all the adjacent warehouses were connected, though rather than being empty like the last, this room was both scattered and stiff, and immediately Midoriya's eyes landed on him. He sat in a chair in the middle of the room, almost under a spotlight, with his head down. His once wild hair that Midoriya remembered whipping around that night in the alley was matted down with grease and oil, limply hanging off his scalp. His clothes were a bland, ill-inducing shade of misery, his arms bound in front of him in what looked to be an almost block of cement. He hung motionlessly from the rest of the straps binding him to the chair. His face, crudely wrapped in cheap bandages, held no visible life, even without being able to see his eyes through the overcast shadow of his bangs. And still, Midoriya's heart started into overdrive, dormant fear pumping through his blood. The multitude of guards surrounding him perked up at the sound of their entry and swiftly moved back into their station positions to block the prisoner's line of sight. They weren't quite fast enough, however, and for just a second, the hero killer's eyes, peering through the tiny slits in his bandages, met with Midoriya's. "Is that him?" The teen's throat closed up. Aizawa instantly stepped around to Midoriya's side. "Nezu, I don't care what you think you're getting out of this, but putting Midoriya back into a space with a hero killer is not—" "His name is Stain," Nezu interrupted dismissively. "Or Akaguro, whichever you prefer. But not his epithet. We don't give him that kind of power here." "You're missing the point." "Regardless, there's nothing anyone can do at this point to back out of what was agreed upon. You signed the paperwork." He shrugged before focusing on Midoriya, pointing offhandedly at one of the many cameras mounted in the warehouse. "You see those cameras? The Hero Association made a deal with Stain not long after he was admitted to Tartarus. He will provide any and all details he obtained working with the League of Villains, all in exchange for granting this request of his. The Hero Association insisted they have a live feed to ensure that nothing goes wrong on this end." Midoriya looked up into the camera lens, then quickly looked away, not wanting the evident anxiety in his eyes archived for all to see. "I'm sure you understand just how crucial the information could be. It's all for the safety and the good of the public." The teen bit his lip. "But my Nomu's tearing up all of Hosu. Now that's much more interesting." The iron on his tongue reminded him of the promise he had sworn when he decided who he was going to be. He swallowed. I get it. He turned around to Aizawa, meeting his trapped and disordered gaze and trying to quell both his and his own fears. Nodded with an air of false confidence that fell apart like plastic. It's okay. The teacher let out a heavy breath. Okay. Okay, Midoriya. Wonderful, Nezu clapped. Now that that's all settled, if we could begin. Midoriya and Aizawa stood around awkwardly, unsure of what the principal could possibly mean at this point, but they soon realized the command wasn't meant for them, as the guards around the hero killer, Stain, moved instead. The men forced Stain out of his slouch, and Midoriya's breath hitched as they started to undo the numerous restraints holding the murderer bound. Now, as per his request, we're allowing Stain to dictate the course of this session uninterrupted, Nezu elaborated as if a criminal wasn't being released behind him, which entails that only Midoriya will be active during this. Interference from any party will not be tolerated. The rodent's gaze drifted somehow toward Gami, who had been uncharacteristically quiet beside Midoriya. The ghost looked nervously at his successor, desperately hoping to hear the boy refute, but hung his head in defeat at the silent response instead. I don't like this, Nezu. Why do you think I insisted on you being here specifically, Aizawa? I trust in your ability to handle the situation should one arise, but only at my command. Besides, Stain has already been fitted with a kill switch collar, should anything begin to get out of hand. Nezu pulled a paw out of his pocket, revealing a small button, barely larger than one of his fingers. He's been briefed on what will occur. Midoriya paled, and couldn't stop his eyes from shooting toward the hero killer in response, only to settle on the sickening shine of a metal collar wrapped tightly around his neck. So there's nothing to worry about. The pit in his stomach had to disagree. By now, many more individuals had joined them in the limited space of the warehouse. Some were easily recognizable as extra guards to add to the room's cavalry at the effective release of such a dangerous prisoner. Some not so much, stationed precariously around the room like vultures to a corpse, but all came in without so much as a sound, finding their place and merely waiting for a command to initiate. All of which made Midoriya much, much more uncomfortable. Nezu glanced at his watch. Well, let's not keep the association waiting much longer. Midoriya, if you would. Confused, the boy looked around until Nezu gave him a small wave with his paw, away from them and towards Stain, who stood ominously with nothing but a metal threat around his throat. And with the fear of a wounded animal, Midoriya nudged himself forward, away from Gami, away from Aizawa, away from anyone who could possibly keep him safe, till he found himself alone in the center of the room with no one but the hero killer staring back at him. Stain seemed to look him up and down before finally settling at his eyes. Owari, it's good to see you've recovered since that night. As for these two, they've let their imperfections drive them, and for that, they don't deserve the title of a hero. Midoriya fought the shudder that ran through his entire body. Like the rusted hinge on a door, Stain turned his gaze toward Nezu instead, causing the room to suddenly freeze over in a collective stiffen. Am I allowed to begin? Nezu merely smiled. Just remember what we discussed. Stain narrowed his eyes at the rat, but nodded in agreement regardless, turning back to Midoriya. It's rare in this day and age to find heroes who actively use weapons in the line of duty. It's quite the quick way to quash the public's perception. We've become far too accustomed to the nature of deadly quirks passing us along the sidewalk without a second thought, yet the level of panic that ensues at a blade. Perhaps it's merely a matter of an evil the eye can see. He shook his head in disappointment. Regardless, no hero who truly claims the profession to save lives can afford to do so with only a fraction of a quirk. What right do you have to call me pathetic when you've only been using half your power and it's not enough? To fear your own quirk. Stain paused for a moment, seemingly in thought. It ends today. Show me your blade. Midoriya hesitated, eyes darting around for some gesture of approval that wasn't from the murderer in front of him, but everyone seemed to be looking at him to continue, not wanting to drag things out longer than necessary. He sucked in a breath, the familiar weight of his weapon landing in his hands without any more of a thought. Stain perked up at the blade, seeming to marvel at it now, the semi-lax environment of Tartarus warehouse compared to the actual heat of their first alleyway battle. He stepped forward to get a closer look, but his trained eyes, even from the borders of his crudely wrapped facial bandages, did not miss the way the boy in front of him fought back a heavy flinch as he approached. Stain frowned, but masked it under pursed lips. Midoriya held out his scythe as far as he could before it would slip out of his hands, trying to limit how close he actually needed to be to the hero killer. Everything, the magnitude of that night, was coming back to him in full force. His nose was starting to pick up the faintest sense of blood mixed with street grime. His throat grew hoarse with the echoes of his past screams, begging for Ida's life. His eyes watered at the remnants of smoke still in the air. At least, that's what he told himself. Still, he steeled himself as best as he could. He would not cry, not here, not in front of all these people who didn't care about him or how he felt. He was stronger than that, than them. He had to be. Stain circled the outstretched weapon, eyeing the long and stocky wooden handle with its aged grooves and knots. He spent a lot of time at the end of the scythe's gargantuan blade, running his fingers down the side, noting the scars of time and use at its edges. He seemed to stare, where the handle met the blade, perhaps at the strangeness of what Midoriya had just assumed to be a hole, carved out purposely by some death before him. He'd asked Ami about it before, but of course the ghost had no idea. Well, Stain hummed, stepping back in thought. It's definitely not the most beginner-friendly of tools. Needless to say, scythes overall hold very limited combat potential. Heavy, slow, and only a small area of blade effectiveness because of the curve. Midoriya perked up a bit defensively, bouncing his weapon tightly in his hands. It wasn't heavy, at least not until he'd swung it a few times, and it certainly wasn't slow, if Todoroki's ice from the sports festival tournament had anything to say. And yeah, while he couldn't do much with the blade itself, that's why he'd figured out the other ways to use it. He brought his weapon closer to himself stubbornly. He was doing just fine on his own. Still, Stain continued, to use a scythe is the most effective with the intent to cut flesh. Midoriya clenched his grip on the scythe, trying to stop his shaking hands. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to hurt anyone like that. The fear that ran through his blood at the memories of his own scars at the hero killer's weapons. He didn't want anyone to feel that towards him. He didn't want people to be afraid of him, like he feared the hero killer, like he sometimes feared himself. Stain narrowed his eyes again, not that Midoriya had the presence of mind to notice. However, such a connotation is not necessarily reflective of its true nature. Causing injury strategically is a tactic many heroes employ on the field, though some better than others. He paused for a moment. All Might's quirk requires him to physically subdue his foes. He simply uses his fists rather than a weapon, which I suppose helps to excuse it. Still, you should know true heroics require some blood to be spilt, in one way or another. Midoriya bit back a frown of his own, with Stain still under the delusion that his murders were justified by some definition of heroics, because, yeah, there was something wrong with the heroic system if people like Endeavor were allowed to be cherished and praised, but to be the sole hand of judge, jury, and executioner, to decide alone who was worthy, to stare down humanity like a colony of ants and choose whether or not they deserved to walk on the same earth. No one was meant to have that kind of power. Even from under his gloves, Midoriya pressed his nails into his skin. With a curved blade, Stain ran a finger dangerously along the edge. The inside can easily hug a target's extremities. Midoriya's breath hitched as the hero killer casually threw an arm around the scythe. Then, even a brief tug can easily cut deep into the skin. The scar on Midoriya's leg throbbed painfully. Debilitating injuries are best at the arms to disable an opponent, or at the legs to demobilize them. Of course, Midoriya swore he couldn't dare breathe as Stain then stepped fully into the curved space of the scythe, almost leaning against the inside of the blade. You'll need to learn how to catch your opponents anywhere inside this space, and you'll need enough control to stop a swing in a moment's notice. You rely on your quirk too much. Midoriya forced the memory out of his head. You catch someone in the neck here, and you'll end the fight. But how is up to you. He couldn't stop his mind from flashing back to every one of the 17 premonitions the hero killer plagued him with. The way the air stung with blood-iron sharpness, the way the moonlight refracted off the murder weapon of choice, the way he swore he could taste the red that dribbled from that maniac smile. Why did he have to be here? If this was what his scythe was worth, would it be wrong to never pick it up again? Would he truly be less of a hero because of it? What right do you have to call me pathetic, when you've only been using half of your power and it's not enough? He blinked away the tears. It's all about control, and control requires practice. Stain then stepped out of the blade's reach. So I want you to try and cut me. That was enough to make Midoriya step back, his eyes widening as his voice was finally pulled out of his throat. What? I want you to take what I've said, and try to immobilize me. Midoriya instinctively shook his head, glazing around frantically for someone else to intervene. But why is someone like you trying to become a hero? I'm not. I can't. You don't belong as a hero, especially not with a dangerous quirk like that. They'll... Using your quirk so recklessly, like you'll never hurt anyone. Midoriya shut his eyes tightly, like pressing them together would suddenly erase all the echoes bouncing around, and said he couldn't. He couldn't dare. He'd worked so hard to gain the surface-level trust he had, the naivety of his classmates, the reputation amongst his teachers, and the delicate balance beam that he walked in the public's eye. He couldn't just throw that all away, because a murderer told him that shedding blood was good. Have you heard nothing of what I've said? Stain's eyes easily swept over the boy's trembling stature. You still choose to hold on to fear? What right do you have to call me pathetic? You've only been using half of your power, and it's not enough. Aizawa, who'd been standing on the sidelines with remarkable resolve, if it could be called that, turned to Nezu in nervous haste. We should stop this. Nezu shook his head. Do not interfere. Midoriya inched back again. I don't... Aizawa felt the air behind him drop severely in temperature. Nezu. You're a fool to fear your own power when you have me to fear instead. No one was ready when Stain lunged at the teen, even without a weapon, dressed in nothing but cheap rags, hair matted with grease. The wave of bloodlust that emanated from the hero killer glued the numerous guards and other staff to the floor. Aizawa's capture scarf, which seemed to activate of its own accord, immediately fell back upon his shoulders. The cold feeling behind him grew tenfold, but did not move. Nezu held the kill switch delicately in his palm, but it did not go off. Everything in Midoriya's mind seemed to switch itself off as the world around him had morphed back into that dreadful alleyway. All his mind knew was his teeth, his tongue, his blood, all in slow motion, reliving the nightmare that had mixed itself with 17 others. He dived out of the way, just as the hero killer dived for him, and suddenly the scythe in his hands weighed nothing as he swung it without a thought more. Stain lurched his head to follow, but found that he could not. The curve of the blade had stopped mere inches from his flesh, just above his metal collar, and Midoriya held it there, the threat of sinking the edge into flesh quiet, even in his trembling hands. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak, everyone almost captivated by what could have been interpreted as a painting hanging on a museum wall, a moment captured in fine art, so overwhelmingly authentic that it could bring them back in time, even if only a few seconds, those few seconds replaying over and over again. And then Stain smiled, even from the jaws of death. That was good. Very good. No one had the gall to notice Nezu pocketing the kill switch. Now, let's try again. Midoriya and Aizawa talked less and less with each trip back and forth from Tartarus. Neither were sure when they'd stopped feeling Gami's cold air in place of their own, but Midoriya wasn't ready for everything to hit him as hard as it did one particular trip back, where the universe itself was determined to wring the tears out of him like a dusty beach towel. He stared unwaveringly out his backseat window for the entire drive, determined to forget that Aizawa was only a seat beside him, determined to forget the painfully helpless reflection that stared back at him. His hands, he couldn't get them to stop shaking, absently rubbed up and down his arms, discovering new bumps and bruises he hadn't even realized he'd gotten this time. He'd tapped into a whole new section of willpower to keep all his weaknesses locked behind his eyes. He wasn't alone. Just because he couldn't see the driver through the tinted glass didn't mean shit. The Hero Association probably had this car somewhat bugged at the very least, and Aizawa, he couldn't cry in front of Aizawa. He couldn't cry in front of the man who'd witnessed every shake, every tremble, every look of hesitation each and every time he had to step back inside that warehouse. He never did anything. Why didn't he do anything? Any time he looked back, all he saw was that anguishedly trapped look in his eyes mixed with sickening pity, and it made him so angry. Why did Aizawa make him so angry? He could feel the itch in his veins to just back into the nearest corner with his scythe until everyone finally left him alone, bearing the blade like the fangs of a wounded animal. Would Stain be happy? Would Nezu be happy? Would that be enough to finally make this all worth it? But there were no corners to hide in, inside the Hero Association's car, so Midoriya would never truly know. So when the car finally dropped them off back home, Midoriya figured he would find out, wasting no time running straight to his room once Aizawa unlocked the door. He slammed his door shut, locking it unconsciously from behind, and once he heard the lock click, his legs gave out on him. He sank to his knees in a graceless heap as his hands struggled to catch the sobs he could no longer contain. Gami floated between the wall for a moment, before sinking down too, moving to cradle the boy in his arms. Don't! It was the clearest thing that had come out of Midoriya's mouth all day as he shoved Gami away. He then realized what he'd done and curled further into himself, some cocktail of guilt and melancholy wrecking his entire body. Just leave me alone. Yamada had been waiting patiently in the kitchen for both of them to return, and didn't even get the chance to ask about dinner before Midoriya had practically trampled him in an effort to escape to his room. He turned back to Aizawa, who still hadn't bothered to close the front door yet either, staring absently down the hall as if Midoriya's steps had burned through the hard wood itself. Sho? And that was all it took, as Aizawa reflexively slammed the door shut too. Damn it, Sashi! Fuck! Midoriya jumped as the shout easily erupted through the walls, and he wailed harder into his hands, muffling the sounds with his skin. I hate him. I hate him so much. Gami looked confused, drifting slightly closer again. You don't hate him? Yamada tried to approach his partner, but stopped when Aizawa threw his arms up violently. I can't do this anymore, Zashi. Midoriya jumped again, his lungs heaving. All I do is ruin everything. He hates me. He hates me and he deserves to. Why would he ever love me? He doesn't. He never stops Nezu. The teen hiccuped, choking on his tears. I hate him. You do not ruin anything, and he does not hate you. Gami spoke firmly. Why do you think he hates you? He wiped the tears and snot from his gloves on the floor. I just cause everyone problems. He doesn't want to deal with me anymore. My curse, my quirk. Midoriya physically retched. He hates me. He never stops Nezu because he hates me. Why did I tell him? Aizawa fought the urge to pace around the room, and instead, his cries continued to bellow about the house. Every time I let Nezu take us to Tartarus, I'm letting him hurt him. I'm standing there, letting our kid face down a literal murderer who nearly killed his two best friends right in front of him, all because I can't bother to fight the fucking rat. The fucking rat who had the nerve to call me an extension. Yamada stiffened. Nezu said, What the hell do I do, Zashi? I can't keep screwing everything up. He wiped his eyes. What the hell do we do? Gami turned away from the wall. See? He doesn't hate you. The ghost choked up. He does love you. Midoriya, who'd started silently sobbing into his hands again, just shook his head. I don't understand. I'm just making him fight with Nezu, and then he says he'll stop Nezu, but he doesn't. He doesn't care. Why does he care? Yamada wrapped Aizawa in his arms, opting to ignore the wetness trickling down his back. I'm so sorry, Sho. I didn't realize how much Nezu was... He sniffled. It hasn't been perfect, but I don't think Midori thinks that you're screwing anything up. How could he not? Aizawa pulled away suddenly. I can't even protect him. I promised him I wouldn't let Nezu make him do anything he didn't want to, and I can't do shit. I tried, and he pulled the ward card on me. The further his mind continued to wander, the more deflated he got until he was sinking back into Yamada's arms again. I thought for once, maybe Nezu and I could see eye to eye on this. I thought he'd finally connected with another person. I don't understand what happened. No matter gods, longevity, or mortal conflictions, whenever you call for me, I will always be at your side. Kami grabbed his hood, digging his fingers into his worn robe as spasms ran throughout his soul. That voice, He hurt, just as Aizawa did. He'd promised and he'd failed. He couldn't keep her safe. He couldn't keep... Who? Midoriya rubbed his eyes, his nose trying to wipe away all the red from his face, ignoring the burn as he rubbed his face raw. Still, he choked on tears whose origins he could no longer discern. A lasting anger stubbornly settled into his heart as he drowned in hopelessness. I'm just hurting him. He can't help me. He can't do anything. The teen sank further into the floor, further into his heap of guilt. I can't do anything. He turned to his mentor. With a watery stare, Gami immediately drifted back over, and this time, Midoriya did not push him away. What am I supposed to do? He buried his fingers, his skin, every part of his body, into as much of Gami's robe as he could. I don't want Aizawa-sensei to leave me. I don't want Nezu to hate me. I'm so tired of feeling like this. Midoriya clenched his hands, lamenting the feeling of polyester on his palms. But I can't stop Nezu. I can't stop my curse. All the bad things happening right now are my fault. The last bit of strength Midoriya had left gave out on him. Damn it! I don't want to be alone anymore. It's not fair. Yamada cupped Aizawa's face, brushing away some evidence of weakness with the tip of his thumb, a solemn smile gracing his features. You've always been so headstrong about handling things on your own. Your sense of responsibility, it's one of the things I love most about you. The smile then faded away. But you can't keep trying to handle Nezu all by yourself. Aizawa grimaced. What am I supposed to do then? We're a team show. The blonde's hands dropped back to his sides, balling themselves into fists. I want Midori safe and happy just as much as you do, so we need to do this together. Gami strung his fingers through his successor's mop of sweaty hair, his hand pressed gently against the wall still. You're not going to be alone anymore. I promise. The words felt dry and sick in his mouth. They will not leave you. You don't know that. Midoriya responded defensively, his own head pressed against the wall too. They could. I might. There was a noise, a scuffle from the other side of the room. The two looked up away from each other, and the hardwood floor soaked with tears, toward the bed by the wall. Midoriya swore he felt his heart stop as his eye settled on a glimpse of gray fur. I know Nezu had always been unorthodox, brash, and Yamada looked off to the side with a bit of shame. Apathetic at times. But even through all that, I trusted him. I trusted his decisions and his judgment, even if I didn't really get it. Zashi, Aizawa started. Midoriya tried to scuttle away, but he was already up against the wall and could move nowhere else as Lynx fully popped out from behind the bed. The hurricane of emotions he thought had finally been laid to rest brewed back up again, as the quiet resolution of hopelessness was nothing against unconscious, instinctual panic. Please don't. Silent tears trickled down his face as his heart tried to flush out everything it was so tired of bottling up. Please, I need this. Yamada could see the look of disagreement on the other's face a mile away. I trusted Nezu, even when he sprung Midori on us. And look where we are now. Aizawa stuttered, but halted his thoughts, going silent in stubborn agreement. Lynx stopped his advance, almost cocking his head in confusion. He let out a small yelp, small eyes fixated on the splotches on Midoriya's face, the red corners of his eyes, the watery shine on his cheeks. The boy tried desperately to wipe it all off, but his heart just kept weeping a sadness aged like fine wine. His breath hitched. Everything hurts, and I'm so scared of losing everything, and I don't know how to fix it, and I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I can't anymore. Gami held him close, but for once Midoriya couldn't tell if his shivers were from the ghost's chilled presence or his own over-abused nerves. So please just let me have this. Don't take this from me. The voice hero snorted lightly, placing a hand back on Aizawa's arm in soft reassurance. But, now is a lot different than before. We didn't have Midori to worry about then, but now... Yamada looked at him in seriousness. It's our job to take care of him, to protect him, to be whatever he needs. The kitten stared quietly, seeming to sink into the weight of Midoriya's words, the weight of the feeling that dragged down the room, a feeling that wasn't the heaviness, a sugary peace he was so accustomed to, and almost in disappointed acceptance. Lynx lowered his head, allowing the thick melancholy to remain. Midoriya's tears stopped in their own thoughts of surprise, as he sank his head back against the wall in guilty relief. I didn't actually think. He froze, the words caught in his throat as Lynx crawled into his lap, settling his own head against Midoriya's stomach. The cat made himself comfortable, cuddling as much of his small body onto Midoriya's clothes as possible before looking back up at him, almost asking for permission. And if that means standing up to Nezu and fighting his decisions, Yamada nodded firmly, then we will. Together. Aizawa leaned down to bury his face into the other's shoulder, trying unsuccessfully to smother his sniffles. But even if Yamada heard, he didn't mention it. Midoriya didn't even realize he'd started sobbing again, too preoccupied with holding the kitten close to him, trying to feel his warmth through the thick layer of grief and polyester. And Lynx didn't fight it, girdling himself as close as he possibly could get, trying a new way to push all the sadness away. Thanks, Sashi. I don't know what I'd ever do without you. And Gami held them silently, pulling them all together like the comfort of a cherished blanket. Thank you. All right, listeners, that was an angsty one. This concludes Chapter 45 of Deku and Death. Chapter 46 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying this fic. Let me know your thoughts and reactions, and as always, thank you so much for listening.